go for refuge until I'm enlightened to the Buddha, the Dharma, and the Sangha, to the merits of giving and the other perfections. May I become a Buddha to benefit all sentient beings. I go for refuge until I'm enlightened to the Buddha, the Dharma, and the Sangha, to the merits of giving and the other perfections. May I become a Buddha to benefit all sentient beings. I go for refuge until I'm enlightened to the Buddha, the Dharma, and the Sangha, to the merits of giving and the other perfections. May I become a Buddha to benefit all sentient beings. And then in Lama Tsongkhapa's text, we're still in the section on calm abiding, but actually very quickly now, and today we'll get into a section that's kind of like I would consider it like a transitional section between calm abiding and special insight. And then special insight is a very long kind of next section. Anyway, okay, so where we left off, I'll just pick up there. The heading is the signs of possessing attention along with a clarification of doubts. So here when he says the signs of possessing attention, which is the first of these sections, he's talking about the signs of having achieved calm abiding, shine in Tibetan, or shamatha, right? Pali? It's both Pali. Is that the same in Pali and Sanskrit? So here he says, he's kind of already covered some of this, but he's making it more clear. So he's saying the signs by which to recognize that you yourself or someone else has achieved calm abiding are set forth in the Shravaka level. So the Shravaka levels is a text by Asanga. He says, so he said, so he's saying here there are four signs of having achieved calm abiding that he lists here. He says a set of four. So one is a mind included in the form realm, right? So we said that last time, that for the person who's achieved calm abiding, they're what's called, and we said this, technically it's called and we're getting into more detail about this, but it's called the preparatory level of the first concentration. So the form realm means like one of the dhyanas, the concentrations. So it's no longer in the desire realm, right? So that's the first of these four descriptions of somebody who's achieved calm abiding is saying that the person has achieved this preparatory level, at least, or initially it's the preparatory level of the first concentration. And that first concentration, just like this is actually, I brought these just to tell people. There are a couple of books that go into these in great detail. One is called Meditative States in Tibetan Buddhism by Ladi Rinpoche and Denbo Locho Rinpoche, and translated by Jeffrey Hopkins and Leah Zoller. And they go into great detail about the four concentrations here. And then there are four concentrations that are part of so I said this last time, just a brief review, right? According to one way of describing samsaric existence, actually, they'll often say this in Buddhist scriptures. You'll hear the three realms, right? So one is the desire realm, the form realm, and the formless realm. So the desire realm is the realm we're in. Human realm is part of the desire realm. Animals, and actually if you see the six realms, most, like the hell beings, the hungry ghosts, the animals, the humans, the demigods, and many of the gods are all in the desire realm. But then there are like gods, they say, or divine beings, you can call them, who are in these realms of the four concentrations, so they're of the form realm. And then there are beings who are in the formless realms. And all those realms, the four form realms and the four formless realms, are achieved through the force of meditative concentration, through calm abiding, and then these different meditative concentrations that we're going to get into how do you go to those realms in a minute. But so this book describes them in detail, and so does this book, Calm Abiding and Special Insight. This book is really mainly about the meditative states in Tibetan Buddhism, and this book is more about how do you achieve calm abiding, but it goes into some detail about the nature of those different concentrations. And I just shared those because you'll see Lama Tsongkhapa here, that's not his main subject, right? Those are mainly taught in these different texts by Asanga and by Maitreya. Here he's only dealing with them to the extent that they're relevant to the Lamrim practice, so he doesn't go into as much detail. And he says that at one point. He says, I'm not going to go into as much detail because it would be too many words for our purpose. So I just wanted to mention those. But okay, so going back. So the sign that a person has achieved calm abiding, which is the goal that he's been describing, first, as I said, is that the person's mind is now no longer in the desire realm, it's in the form realm. The second, which you mentioned yesterday, is that the person has physical pliancy, right? So this sense of lightness of body, of a lack of heaviness, a lack of fatigue, a kind of an ability to physiologically be energetic and apply yourself to whatever you want without sort of your body. You know, we described that last time, this idea, this sense that for ordinary people, our bodies can be sluggish, it can be hard to get ourselves energized. You know, even if we think, oh, I'd like to do this, our body often resists doing what our mind would like it to do. A person who has calm abiding, has achieved physical pliancy, has this experience of physical lightness and physical facility, or physical, like their body is willing to do what their mind wants it to do. And then mental pliancy, right? Same thing. Their mind doesn't get, you know, like oftentimes we'll think, oh, I'd like to concentrate, but then our mind won't concentrate. Or I'd like to apply myself to, you know, but I want to apply myself to love, and then instead you feel annoyance or something. For a person with calm abiding, what he's saying here is that the mind becomes very flexible and pliable. And the last one is single-pointedness, right? That the person, when they try to focus on something, their mind completely absorbs single-pointedly, and that without distraction. So a person so he says, when you've achieved those four, those are signs that you've achieved calm abiding. Then he says, also you are enabled to purify mental afflictions by means of calm and coarse paths, or paths associated with aspects of the Four Noble Truth. I'm going to go through each of these and just describe what he's talking about, because I think the words, it's hard to be clear. And he's going to go into more detail about this, but what he's saying is, as we say, right, the mental afflictions, right, we all know, you know, those, there are many lists of them, right, craving and, you know, desire, anger, and ignorance, or all the other mental afflictions, jealousy and pride, and so on. So here what he's saying is, once you have calm abiding, you develop this ability to, what does he say here, purify or pacify, you could say, the mental afflictions. And he's going to go into detail about this later in the next page, I think. But he's saying there are two different ways that a person who has calm abiding it's like, for us, when we have a mental affliction, right, it's quite difficult, isn't it? Like, you know, it's like if you're really caught up in anger, for example, you know, you have to apply these kind of different reasonings, and you try to deal with your anger, or you may meditate on opposites of anger, like love and kindness. But the anger it takes a lot of effort to shift your mind. What he's saying here is that the person with calm abiding has this ability to, and he calls them purify. So, and there are two different types of purification. One is temporary, and he's saying you can temporarily purify them through calm abiding. And he says here, with the paths associated, the course on this is calm abiding. By means of calm and course. What he's saying there, and we'll get into more detail, is that this person can sort of look at the desire realm as coarse, at the form realm as more subtle, and by sort of thereby moving their mind further into the form realm, the first concentration, all the mental afflictions associated with desire realm become inactive, which is a humongous relief, they say, you know, a humongous source of pleasure. And so the person has the ability to do that. And he's saying, or the person can apply themselves to the Four Noble Truths. In other words, and ultimately it means the teachings on the Noble Path, so to selflessness. And in that way, the person can suppress or purify their mental afflictions temporarily and also permanently, if they realize selflessness. So he's saying these new abilities become available to the person once they've achieved calm abiding, but before you achieve calm abiding, you can't do that. Even if you want to, you're not able to. Once you have calm abiding, these things become possible. Then he says, he's just describing what it's like to have the signs of having achieved calm abiding. He says, physical and mental pliancy arise very quickly when the mind is equipoised inwardly. So there he's saying, for the beginner who's just achieved calm abiding, you know, when they're not in calm abiding, they may feel a little bit of like slight lack of pliancy, But as soon as they concentrate their mind, all that goes away and their mind and body again become very pliant. So they have this ability to sort of, you can imagine that, can't you? Like if the person were starting to feel tired, they could enter concentration and then they feel refreshed, things like that. Then he says, for the most part, the 5 hindrances, desire for sensual pleasures, sleepiness, and so forth, do not occur. Let's briefly say, so what he's saying here is that the 5 hindrances are a list related to meditation, and there are obstacles to meditation. So one is sensory desire, right? If you're having sensory desires, you're not able to concentrate because your mind's going towards what you desire. Ill will or anger, right? I mean, we all know that. If you're feeling angry, you're not going to be able to meditate very effectively and concentrate. Then another one, here they translate sleepiness. There are different ways. Some people call it sleepiness or sloth or torpor. So the kind of heavy, tired mind. Again, that's a hindrance to meditation. The fourth of them is, again, there are different translations, restlessness or worry or agitation, which is different than the others, right? Where your mind's just feeling sort of agitated, let's say, or restless, and then doubt. So what he's saying here is, for the most part, those 5 hindrances don't arise once you've achieved calm binding. And he's saying for the most part, what he's saying there is, for a person who's new to calm binding, it's not like they've 100% completely disappeared, but they become very, very weak. They're rarely present. And then he says, and even when you arise from your meditative equipoise, you're still imbued with some physical mental pliancy. Okay, so he's saying, it's not the same, when the person's in calm abiding itself, absorbed on a mental object, they have this kind of experience of bliss, physical and mental bliss, and physical and mental pliancy. And he's saying when the person arises, it's not the same as when they're in meditative concentration, but those feelings of lightness and flexibility and so on go with them into the post-meditative time when they're not in meditation. And you get the idea here. So he's going into all these details to say, actually it's quite important, we said this a little last time, because it's easy for people to misunderstand and think they have calm abiding when they don't. He's going to get into later other mistakes people make. But so he was trying to describe in detail what it's like so that the person can go, well, have I just achieved sort of some ability to concentrate, or have I actually achieved calm abiding? And so he's going into detail so that the person at that level doesn't make the mistake of thinking they're a point they're not at, so that they'll keep trying to get to that point if they're close. Because the person would be mistaken, it may be getting close, but this is a sign. Are you really there about it? Then in the next section, I'm not going to read the whole section of this one, but what he starts saying here is that basically what he's getting into the next section is, he says, for the person who's achieved calm abiding, as they continue to practice meditation, what they find is that both their mind and their body continue to develop more and more pliancy. So in other words, the pliancy they've just achieved when they achieve calm abiding. And part of that, I think, the way he describes it here is that, I'll just kind of do a brief thing about this. In Tantric Buddhism, there's this Vajrayana, right? There's this many teachings that describe how the mind and this kind of subtle, usually they translate the term winds, or energies, you could say. It's like the energies that are similar to the energies that are understood in, acupuncture, things like that. So it's like subtle energies of the body. So there's this idea that the mind and the subtle energies that are in our body are interconnected or interdependent. And sometimes in Vajrayana Buddhism, they have this phrase. They say, the winds are like a horse with a rider. The mind rides on the winds. There's sometimes a phrase like that. So it's just a metaphor, right, for trying to describe the experience of that our mind sort of, as it moves in different ways and sort of shifts and so on, that's related to the shifting of, that they're interdependent actually. If you shift your mind, it affects your body. If your body's in a certain state, it affects your mind. And that as your mind sort of moves in one way or another and in different ways with different emotional states, different afflictive emotions or positive states, that the subtle energies in your body are also moving. So here what he's getting, I think that's a good, understanding that will help understand this paragraph. What he's saying here is, for the person who's achieved calm abiding, as they continue to sort of practice meditative concentration with this incredible ability to focus now, right, that as they continue sort of focusing in this kind of total absorption or equipoise on the objects of meditation, whatever the object of meditation is, what's happening is that in a way they're refining the subtle energy in their body, right? Every time they kind of enter into these very subtle states of concentration, like what happened previously continues, which is that any kind of, what's the word, like disturbed energies in their body become pacified or expelled or something. And the energies or the winds of their body become more and more refined and subtle and sort of serviceable. And therefore their body becomes more and more pliant. And their mind, and as their body becomes more pliant, there's no longer disturbed energies or winds in their body, and therefore their mind becomes even more pliant. And that process continues as they continue to meditate, where they're like refining more and more the energies, and that therefore their mind is becoming more and more pliant, their body is becoming more and more pliant. And that's sort of this process where they go hand in hand or something like that. Does that kind of make sense?
So you're saying the energy moves?
Yeah.
Externally, beyond my space.
Yeah, well, actually what they say is that, like, so for example, in the earlier part it said this, that as a person sort of develops calm abiding and does this, actually what starts to happen is that some of the, what's it called, like, just, let's say if the person has disturbed energy,
Yeah.
that actually gets dispelled out of their body, and all that remains in their body are these more refined, peaceful winds. So like that.
So they're constantly moving like around.
Yeah, and also one other thing they say is that when a person's thinking discursively, those winds are moving inside of us, actually.
Yeah.
They say when the person's in calm abiding, they become extremely pacified and stop moving, like that they stop moving, or their amount of movement becomes very, sometimes they actually stop moving, they say. When the person's in calm abiding,
So
those winds
like,
stop.
You're creating like a world, like a box in a way.
That's the way of saying it, I think.
Yeah, interesting.
I cannot help but share the words of the great sage George Clinton, which is, "Free your mind and your will follow." Very related.
You could-
It's cool.
Okay, so that's that paragraph. Then he says, then I'll just read down the next paragraph, number 3 here. He says, statements from the Shravaka levels. Again, he's basing this whole section on the Shravaka levels. Or here, Shravaka means here, so here levels, meaning like and Shravaka in that sense is, means, like actually, I'll just mention that. Asanga wrote not many texts, but 2 of them. One is the Bodhisattva levels, and the other is the Shravaka or Hira levels, right? So it meant the Bodhisattva levels is describing the paths that Bodhisattvas go through. The Shravaka levels is describing the paths that Hira, meaning somebody who's going to achieve the state of an arhat, individual liberation, goes through. And that he's describing all these different meditative states. Asanga describes them. So he says, apart from that, and the Shravaka levels explains that at the time the mind is first placed single-pointedly, it is placed without mindfulness or attention to anything else whatsoever. And then he quotes it. In order not to turn to all the signs and prevent distraction, you prevent mindfulness and attention to them from the beginning by focusing completely. So that's very simple. What he's just saying here is that for the person who's achieved calm abiding, they essentially pay no attention and give no mindfulness to anything other than their object of meditation, and that way their mind penetrates and is absorbed in the object of meditation. And for a beginner, if they have certain, if the tendency to think about something else arises, they just don't pay attention to it, and their mind will absorb. Now he goes into a whole, somewhat lengthy, here, a page or so, a little over a page, kind of teaching from the Shravaka levels that I'll just kind of go through and describe what he's saying. And I'll start actually, maybe I'll read the actual first paragraph and then describe, and then kind of explain what it's saying. So he says, when you familiarize yourself with that, according to, again, now he's quoting Asanga. Right? So he says, by the stages of focusing on single-pointedness itself and focusing on calm abiding within, right, so that you bring the mind within, you're not distracted to sensory objects, right, you bring the mind within the sphere of mind itself. Be sure to place your mind in just this way on the mental continuum and on the entire continuity of the mind, becoming free from signs, free from discursive thought, and absolutely calm. So there, in the first section, unless you get to jump down, he says here that, okay, so what he's saying here is that by having it gone through those 9 levels and progressing up to calm abiding, you achieve these 3 things, right, that are listed in this sentence. So one is to be free from signs, another is to be free from discursive thoughts, and the third is to be absolutely calm. So he's describing an experience of this person, right, that they've achieved that. And in a minute, he goes, you may think, what are signs? Well, he'll tell that in the next part. He'll tell that in a minute, so I won't jump ahead too much. He's going to describe that. But then he says, right, so you achieve those 3 things. Then he says, when you have achieved the mind of calm abiding in that manner, right, with those 3 qualities, if signs and conceptions arise due to the faults of forgetfulness and unfamiliarity, and if appearances arise due to secondary mental afflictions, if holes start showing, meaning in your concentration, which I like that description, he says, if they become your object from the point of view of having seen their disadvantages earlier, you should not be mindful of such occurrences nor attend to them. So here he's pointing something out. He's saying, so the person who has achieved calm abiding has these 3 qualities, right? But he's saying, I'm describing, what he's basically saying here, he's saying, I'm describing somebody who newly achieved calm abiding, right? So that person, you know, has this amazing new facility, right, with physical pliancy and mental pliancy and bliss, and they can apply their mind. And he's saying, but they're new to calm abiding, right? And so he says, through unfamiliarity or forgetfulness, right? He's saying, that person still isn't so familiar yet with calm abiding, and sometimes, most of the time, their concentration will be great, but due to, you know, for that person, say something happens, right? Somebody comes along and says something, or they have some issue external to them when they're outside of their meditative session that creates a distraction. Well, they're new to calm abiding, and they may still experience some like holes in their practice, right? Some distractions. And then he's giving advice here. He's saying, for that person, and I think it's an implication here. Remember earlier he talked about for ordinary people there are all these like antidotes that we should apply. You know, if you're tired, go outside and look at the sun or splash water on your face. And if you're feeling angry, meditate on love. And if you're feeling desire, you know, sort of meditate on the faults of samsara and so on. Here he's saying for this person, they may still experience these holes or distractions. And he's saying, but for this person, they don't need to apply some other antidote because they have calm abiding, which is so powerful that he's saying, from the point of view of seeing that, in other words, that you already previously understood the faults of distraction and so on. And he says, so basically what he's saying is don't pay any attention. You know, for that person, when distractions or sort of upset or some other thing arises, rarely and occasionally, because it's not going to arise that much since you have calm abiding, but it still can arise because of circumstances outside of your meditation. What he's saying is for that person, they don't have to apply some other antidote. Just go back to focusing on your object, ignore those distractions, and they'll dissolve. Later he says, they'll dissolve like bubbles. You know, if you're in the swimming pool and you push the water down, bubbles form. And then if you just leave them alone, in a few seconds, they're all gone, right? He's saying it's like that. Does that make sense? That all those distractions, if you just go back to focusing on your meditative object, any distractions or discursive thoughts or so on will disappear like the bubbles from the pool. Then he says, through not minding them and not attending to them in this manner, those objects completely disintegrate. And when they have been completely eliminated, the mind is placed on the very absence of appearances. Does that make sense? So, like, in other words, you don't have to do something else, and just by focusing, they'll dissolve. And then Asanga says, "Sir, this object is subtle and hard to comprehend. Therefore, aspire and try hard in order to comprehend it." I'm trying to see if I skipped anything there at first. So here, next Lama Tsongkhapa kind of gives a little bit of a commentary, which I think I mostly covered. But so he's saying, so through the 9 levels, you achieve those 3 things, right? Freedom from signs, freedom from discursive thoughts, and an absolutely calm mind. And he says, this is what I just said. You know, by not pursuing or not paying attention to those thoughts, the mind becomes pacified by itself. You don't have to apply extra antidotes. Yeah, and through the force of your familiarity with meditation, all the distractions or any negative things not conducive to meditation will be pacified by them, naturally, so to speak. Okay, and then he goes into the section. So that there you get the point. He's just saying, don't attend to the distractions, but just focus on your object, and they'll sort of dissolve, like smoke in space, or like water bubbles from the water. They'll disappear. Then he says, now he goes into what does he mean by, Asanga said, the first of the three things Asanga said was you have this freedom from signs. So then Lama Tsongkhapa is saying, so what are the signs, right? What does that mean, freedom from signs? And so Lama Tsongkhapa says, well, there are 10 signs. And again, here he's still describing what's it like to have calm abiding, really. So he says, of the 10 signs, the first 5 are the objects of the 5 senses. So forms, sounds, smell, taste, and touch. So imagine that for a moment, right? The person who has achieved calm abiding has freedom from those, right? From the appearance of forms, sounds, smells, taste, and touch. Then also they have freedom from the 3 poisons, right? So desire, anger, and ignorance. So up to 8. Right? And then he says, and also signs of male and female, right? So bodily characteristics of being male or female. All those things don't appear to the person who's in calm abiding, while they're in calm abiding. It's not, of course, when they come out of calm abiding and they need to eat lunch, they can see forms, right, have taste. What he's saying is, when the person absorbs in meditation, all those disappear. And then he says, this is interesting, he says, as for the matter in which they vanish, first a multiplicity of signs of forms and so forth appear. As soon as they appear, they subside by themselves and are purified. Finally, when you settle into meditative equipoise, the signs of forms, sounds, and so forth do not appear. Only the mind, knowing and clarity, and vibrant happiness do. So you get the idea? So what he's saying here is, like, the person who's achieved calm abiding, like, if it's not, like, when they're not in meditative equipoise, they see trees and houses and so on. But he's saying when that person enters into meditation, right, they sit down to meditate, all of those appearances, how does he say it, dissolve, essentially. As soon as they appear, they vanish, right? So he's saying as the person concentrates their mind, can you imagine? So it's like you get the feeling of what he's describing here, right? Like it's like their mind becomes so concentrated that they no longer experience their senses, right? They're kind of like in deep sleep, right? In deep sleep, no, we're not experiencing clarity and bliss or whatever, knowing and clarity, but their sensory consciousness is no longer function, right? The mental afflictions aren't functioning at that time, right? The 3 mental afflictions. The signs of male and female and so on, right? So the person at that time, and he's describing their experience. Their experience at that point is just mind seeing mind. Right? So he's saying knowing, clarity, and vibrant happiness. That's what's appearing to them. And one of, so the appearance of so their own, all different sensory consciousnesses have shut down. That's clear. Even the experience, and actually it's implied there, right? So even the experience of their own body, right? They're no longer experiencing their own, right? Our experience of our own body is a sense of touch, right? Whereas you can feel your body sitting on the ground, you have a sense of, what's the word, kinesthetic presence. For that person, when they're in a state of meditation, all of that dissolves, right? And their experience is just awareness itself, right? Knowing and clarity, and vibrant happiness. That's the description there. Then he says, now he says how do discursive thoughts subside by themselves. So now he says, since you place your mind as before without being mindful of any thoughts of them, right, of any discursive thoughts, without attending to them, that's where he says it. Discursive thoughts that have arisen like bubbles in water, they cannot proliferate greatly or conjoin, and they subside by themselves. Then, through your sustaining meditation, as explained earlier, your knowledge of the experience and the appearance of bliss, without being stopped deliberately, unable to withstand the focus, subside again by themselves, like bark peeling off. So actually what he's describing here is this, so as the person first sits down to meditate, they may have some discursive thoughts, like, okay, I'm going to meditate or something. Or I'll meditate for this long, or whatever. But what he's saying here is, for us, like, actually it's an interesting description he gives, like, where they proliferate or join together. For us, our discursive thoughts do proliferate, right? And they also join together. They sort of start to connect, right? So you think, how am I doing in my meditation? Oh, I think I'm doing not so well. Oh, that's really unfortunate. Or, oh, I'm doing a good job. Wow, how great. I'm really meditating well. Then you realize, well, I'm thinking about meditating well, I must not be meditating well. Or whatever. Like whereas discursive thoughts connect one to another, right? He's saying here for this person, at the beginning there may be a few discursive thoughts, but they're like a few bubbles that sort of dissolve. And as they concentrate, they dissolve. Then he's saying also, there's an experience of meditation that's blissful, right? But as the person continues to focus in meditation, the bliss itself, which is kind of a distraction, becomes more subtle. Does that make sense? Because otherwise, if the bliss is if you get too caught up in the bliss, that itself weakens your attention or something. It becomes like it becomes slightly agitating or slightly distracting or something. So he's saying, that's where he's saying it's like, that even that sort of, and when he says bark falling off, where they're actually, another translation of that was like, when under pressure that the husks of, like if you're dehusking rice or some other grain, under pressure the husks fall off. So he's saying under the pressure of concentration, discursive thoughts and any distraction, and even the distraction of the bliss of meditation itself sort of falls away like a husk. And then what's left is the kernel of clarity, knowing, and pleasure, and kind of subtle bliss. And then he says, so he says here, bliss and knowing of the experience become more subtle. Does that make sense? So it's like a subtle bliss that's no longer distracting, and that can kind of, that conjoins the mind being absorbed. Now he's describing the third of those three qualities next, which we called completely calm, or here he's calling, So he says, at that time, when you're in meditative equipoise, there are no appearances such as that of your own body, and there is a sense as if your mind has become indivisible from space. As you arise from meditation, it feels as if your body has suddenly appeared. Afterward, even afflicted discursive thoughts of hatred and the like that arise are also different from before or originally. They are weak and unable to conjoin over long periods of time. Right? So here you get the idea here, right? He's describing as the person enters meditation, their sense of even of their own body completely disappears. Right? Then when they come out of meditation, it's an interesting description. He says, as if your body suddenly appeared. This is a fascinating description of the state for this person, right? And then he's saying, it's interesting, right? He's saying, and when the person is not in meditation, still, like if somebody, out of old habit, right? The person is not yet some kind of, the person has calm abiding, which is amazing, right? But they're not liberated from all afflictive emotions. Right? So he's saying for that person, they're actually, there are stories like this in some of the old Indian, like, texts of the Mahasiddhas and the Indian masters, where where somebody, like, after the person who was in calm abiding, somebody will come along and insult them, and they do it, and they can still have some kind of emotional experience of a negative experience. He says, but it's not like before. For that person, it's like some kind of, they have so much experience of the clarity and bliss and knowing nature of mind that those thoughts arise and sort of dissolve, or habits of emotion sort of arise and dissolve, but no longer have a grip on the person, the way they do on a normal person. And then he says, these periods are periods of what are called complete pacification. The experience of clarity is great, and you feel that you, and this is an interesting description here. He says, the experience of clarity is great, and you feel you can count the minute particles, meaning like the atoms, right, that are in the pillars and walls of a house. Due to the intense stability factors, sleep, like before when you had not yet achieved meditative stabilization, does not even come during the hours of sleep. It is mixed with meditative stabilization, and you have many pure dream appearances and the like. Right? So he's just describing a little bit more about what's the experience like for a person who achieved calm abiding. Actually, I read that one. There's a story of some of the Gelugpa Mahasiddhas that Professor Jan Willis translated. And one of them describes that. He says, it must have been when he first achieved calm abiding, or soon after, he describes like, I think it was Galwa and Sapa, the great Mahasiddha. And he said at that point, he felt like he could count the atoms in the mountains. He was up in the Himalayas. He said when he would look at a mountain, his experience was as if he could count how many atoms there were inside the mountain. So it's like and that's what Lama Tsongkhapa is describing here, this kind of intense clarity of the mind that's experiential for that person. And then he's saying, we said this last time, that such a person also, doesn't sleep like an ordinary person, and so on. That their sleep is meditative. It has the elements of meditative stabilization, and they don't have ordinary dreams anymore, and so on. Okay, that's the end of that section. And you get the idea. That section is really mostly a description of what's it like. Like it's describing what's it like to have calm abiding. One is it's kind of a fascinating description, but the other is it's for people, so that for y'all, like when you achieve it, then you can look back there and go, okay, I have all those signs. Now I know. I didn't get it wrong. I'm not confused. Any question about that before I go on to the next section, which is a clarification of doubts? Okay.
So when it comes to like a mental affliction, right? Like discursive thoughts, like let's say where do they go? Like where do they go? Those thoughts like this, where do they go? I mean,
Where do they go? What he says is right. Like, is they just stop?
disappear. I mean, what do they?
Yeah.
I mean, they go back to mental continuum.
Yeah, it's like so you say it right. Like, it'd be like if you had just to use an example, like if you had say you had like a pond of water, right, or a swimming pool. Let's say a swimming pool, right? Like so, in the summertime, if nobody's in the swimming pool and it's morning, it's like totally clear, right?
Yeah.
But then if I jump in and swim around and splash and things, there'll be all kinds of waves, right?
Yeah.
But then if there's no wind, then I get out of the pool and I leave it alone. Gradually, those waves will stop,
Yeah.
and again, it will become totally
Fine.
flat, clear, whatever, like that. So it's like that. Or if you say, where'd the waves go, right?
Yeah.
So if you said, where'd the waves go?
Where do they go?
They just pacified, because nothing was stirring them up anymore.
So, I mean, what if you want to have like sex? You achieve calm abiding and then you have sex. So does that mean those mental affliction comes back? This kind of thoughts?
Yeah, that would be like going back in the water and splashing around. Yeah,
So they come back, even though you have calm abiding.
yeah. If you have combating, the mental afflictions can come back. Yeah.
Even when you're eating.
Yeah.
So then you have to go back into concentration. So then you're suffering then, you suffer then.
Yeah. This person still has suffering, for sure.
So then you have to avoid those stuff then, like sex, eating. I mean, you're going to have to eat.
Right, yeah, so the person who has calm abiding is not free from all suffering.
Yeah.
Like, they've just achieved a very powerful mind, but yeah, exactly, they still suffer, for sure.
Okay, so you have to avoid those actions then, I mean.
Well, that person still has to eat, for example, to live.
Yeah.
But, so it's not that, like, they stop eating or something. But for them, what he's saying is that the mental afflictions they have are not as intense as ours.
Yeah.
That they're weaker, that they don't last as long, that they don't have the same power over that person. So that person suffers less.
Yeah.
And has less mental afflictions. But when they're outside of meditation, they do have some mental affliction.
Okay. So since everything is dependent arising, so why does calm abiding depend upon? What does it depend upon?
It depends on the previous 9 levels of meditative practice. So it's a dependent arising that depends on the first level. He described that like steps, right?
Yeah.
In other words, to achieve the second level, it depends on the first. Then the third depends on the second. The fourth depends on and so on, all the way up to the 9th, and then calm abiding depends upon the 9th level. So it's like each one depends on the one before it. And you can't achieve the 8th if you haven't achieved the 2nd, and so on. You have to go in order. So each one depends on the other, yeah.
What about external conditions though? What kind of external conditions? I mean,
Yeah, those are cooperative. Like, so the main cause is the previous ability to concentrate.
Yeah.
But like, just like we say, like, if you have like a corn plant, the corn seed is the main cause.
Yeah.
We also need water and sunlight and so on. So like that, say a quiet place, conducive to meditation and so on, and good companions who aren't distracting you.
Yeah.
Those are cooperative conditions, but the main cause is your own previous achievement of the previous levels.
Okay.
So now Lama Tsongkhapa does, I often point this out, Lama Tsongkhapa does this thing that Lama Tsongkhapa is quite good at, is so good at, many things he's good at, but this is one, is he raises doubts and misunderstandings people could have and clarifies them. He does that over and over, I think, throughout this whole book. So here he says, he asks a question, a doubt, but he says, when the kind of meditative stabilization explained above is achieved, which of the 5 paths is the context to place it in? So he's saying, there are 5 paths, right? This is a general overview of the path structure of the path to enlightenment, right? And so, and whether you're on the vehicle of individual liberation or the Mahayana, right? There's the path of accumulation, the path of preparation, the path of seeing, the path of meditation, the path of no more learning, and one progresses through those. So, and if a hearer, right, a Shravaka progresses through those, and then when they get to the path of no more learning, they would become an Arhat. When a Bodhisattva progresses through those, they progress through those 5, and when they achieve the path of no more learning, they become a Buddha, right? And so this is like the path to enlightenment, right, that he's talking about. He's saying, so okay, when you just described this amazing experience of a person who's achieved calm abiding, whose experiences of just mere clarity and knowing and bliss and so on, like, and their discursive thoughts fall away, in the way he just described and all that. And he's saying, okay, so this remarkable experience I just described, he's saying, which of the 5 paths is that, right? Because if these are the 5 paths to either liberation or full enlightenment, well, this remarkable experience we just described, which is it? What path is it? Actually, does anybody have thought? So what do you think? Which of the 5 paths? Does anybody know? None. Yeah, not necessarily. It's right. And that's what he says here. He says, he actually goes through a whole thing where he says, if the meditative stabilization explained above is cultivated after, he's getting at some technical points here. He's saying, if a person has already realized, he says, actually, one point he makes first is he says, this is very rare. He says, there are rare people who first realize emptiness, actually gain a realization of emptiness. And then they develop calm abiding on the basis of that understanding of emptiness. That's their object of meditation. So instead of visualizing a Buddha or meditating on their breath, they've already realized emptiness conceptually, and their meditative object for meditative concentration is that understanding, a correct understanding of emptiness. And he's saying, for that rare person, who, if they are newly achieved calm abiding, is on the basis of a correct understanding or realization they already previously had of emptiness, then for that person, when they achieve calm abiding, that is one of the 5. They will be on one of the 5 paths. They'll be on the path of accumulation. He says, the path in the context of a path of an ordinary person. So that person will, their achievement of calm abiding will be one of the 5 paths. Geshe Jambagatsu said the path of accumulation in his commentary. So let's play with that. And then he makes another point. He says, but in general, calm abiding is common to non-Buddhists. You don't even have to be Buddhist to achieve calm abiding. And then he says, and there are many non-Buddhist sages, right? He says that non-Buddhist sages who have achieved calm abiding. And some of them have even achieved, many of them, throughout history have achieved the different form realm concentrations and formless realm concentrations, which are even more concentrated than calm abiding itself, or more sort of refined than calm abiding itself. And then he says, and they can even go up through the beyond each one is more refined than the other, so they can go through all the 4 formless, so these non-Buddhist sages can go through the 4 form realm meditative concentrations, and they can achieve the formless realm concentrations, and even go up to the highest one, which is called the peak of samsara. Right? And he's saying, and even the peak of samsara is not included in any of the 5 paths. It's actually not. It's not a path to liberation. It's not a path to Buddhahood in and of itself. So he's saying, in and of themselves, all those different exalted states of concentration are not necessarily a path, any of the 5 paths. They're not necessarily, which means they're not necessarily paths to liberation or enlightenment. Could be, and they're common to Buddhists and non-Buddhists. Anybody can, anybody who does the methods for developing a meditative concentration can achieve those things, and they don't necessarily lead to any particular spiritual goal of liberation or enlightenment. Then he says, now, if your meditative concentration is conjoined with renunciation of samsara, then you could say it's on the Hinayana path, right, the path of individual liberation. If it's conjoined with bodhicitta, you could say it's part of the Mahayana path. Then he says if it's conjoined with generosity and so on, then you can say it's on the path to liberation. But then he makes a point. He says, this is what he's really getting at here. He says, but in terms of their own entity, right? In terms of their own nature, a state of meditative concentration, such as calm abiding, by its in and of itself, or by its own nature, is not a path to liberation or Buddhahood. And it's like one way of saying it, I'll just make a point, is like it's more like it's a very powerful tool that can be used to get, if you let's say it right, if you have some kind of like tool, right? So you could use that tool to build, a temple, or you can use it to build an ordinary house. You can use it for all different things. This is like that way. That meditative concentration, calm abiding, is a very powerful tool, but you can use it. If you decide you want to use it just to achieve a good rebirth in the formless realms or something, that's not the path to liberation, right? You're using that tool to achieve something that's not on the path to liberation. If you use it to meditate just on selflessness, it can become a tool to achieve your own liberation. If you use it in the context of bodhicitta, it becomes a tool to achieve Buddhahood. But so in and of itself, it's not, its own entity is like neutral in that sense, in terms of path to enlightenment. And now he says something, again, that's important, I think, and that people sometimes misunderstand. So he said, so I'll read this whole paragraph, it's on the top of page 236. He says, that is why in meditations without mindfulness and mental activity, the blissful, clear non-conceptuality termed unfabricated by the mind and without grasping is of two types, that which is and that which is not an emptiness meditation, with the mind in equipoise on the meaning of suchness. So first he's making a point. He's saying, and it's actually a kind of a subtle point. What he's saying is, earlier he described that the experience of the person in meditative concentration, right, like calm abiding, right, their experiences of what? Clarity, knowing, and happiness, bliss, right? And he's saying this point, he's saying, there's an implication here, right? It'd be very easy for that person to think they've realized emptiness. Wouldn't it? Whereas if you have the experience, he says your mind is like it's conjoined with space, he said earlier, right? So you can imagine that for a person like that, it would feel like they've realized emptiness, maybe. They could think that. But he's saying, actually, there are two different types of meditative concentration. One is on the conventional nature of mind, which is clear, aware, or knowing, and so on. Right? But that's the conventional nature of the mind. The ultimate nature of the mind is the emptiness of inherent existence of that subtle, conventional nature of mind. Or not subtle, of that conventional nature of mind. Right? And so what he's saying is many people experientially who meditate, it's like such a remarkable experience. Right? You can imagine that if the person says, wow, like look at that. Now I have the experience of like space-like appearance. And when I come out of that experience, my experience of mental afflictions is totally different. It's almost like they're not there. And I feel happy and blissful all the time. And if I do have the slightest bit of a mental affliction, I can just like make it dissolve, like nothing, Then it'd be easy for a person like that to think they've realized emptiness. Right? And what he's saying is, but that's not the, if your experience is of the conventional nature of mind, which is clarity and knowing and blissful, that's not an emptiness meditation. You then have to, the first Panchen Lama says, in his Mahamudra text, actually there's a famous line that he says, he makes this point, he says, many meditators, as if with one voice, are saying, that's the ultimate. And then he says, he was like the tutor of the 4th and 5th Dalai Lamas, and he says, I, Losing Choki Gyaltsen, say that is not the ultimate. The ultimate is the emptiness of death. And he says, and that's a crucial misunderstanding, because we have to realize emptiness, or it's not a path even to our own liberation, much less to Buddhahood. So Lama Tsongkhapa goes on. Therefore, it is extremely important to differentiate them well, for there is much ground for mistaking that which is not a realization of suchness, or emptiness, for its realization. If you do not differentiate them as explained earlier, you will even take meditative stabilization, which is common to this Dharma and that of others, to be the main point of the completion stage of highest Yoga Tantra. You should investigate this in detail. So what he's saying here is, again, because also in Tantra there are experiences of that describe like Tantric Mahamudra, which they say is blissful and clear, and you realize the clear light or something. And again, people can have this experience and think they're realizing that. And he's saying, no, this is an experience that's wonderful, but that's common, that non-Buddhists achieve, and that that can lead to the achievement of just a rebirth in a God realm or something. But it feels, again, you see what he says, but there's much room for misunderstanding, right? And so he's saying, what he's pointing out here is that even in Tibet, where there were a lot of yogis, he sees there were many people who achieved this, which was wonderful, and then thought they'd either achieved the realization of emptiness, or thought they'd achieved the completion stage of highest Yoga Tantra. And he's saying, it's understandable that misunderstanding could happen for people, but it's a humongous misunderstanding, and it's totally different. Not at all the same as completion stage of highest Yoga Tantra, and not at all the same as realization of emptiness. And so he's saying, don't mistake those, because if you do, you won't achieve liberation, right? And you won't achieve in Buddhahood. You'll get stuck with just some good rebirth, and you'll think you're enlightened. Actually, it's quite tragic in a way. That's what they say, is the person who has that experience where they think that's enlightenment, then they think they're enlightened, so they stop, they don't continue on the path, and then, when the positive energy of their meditation runs out, they experience a humongous disappointment of thinking they thought they were Buddha or something, and then they fall back into just being an ordinary suffering being, and then they actually feel angry and resentful and pissed off, hopeless and all that. And so he's saying, don't make that terrible mistake, because if you get to the point where you've realized calm abiding, you now have a tool that could very quickly bring you to the correct realization of emptiness, or to the completion stage of highest Yoga Tantra, and so on. So now is the time to use that to achieve those things, not to waste it with a misunderstanding that you've already achieved the result, which would sort of be like tragic almost, or something, right? It'd be like, a humongous waste of an opportunity. Because with calm abiding, you have this ability to achieve all these other things then, that he's saying are the goal, right? But if you don't know you haven't achieved them, then you won't use it for that purpose. So that's a humongously important point. And then he says, so then how a general indication of how do you traverse the path in dependence upon calm abiding, right? So you have this, when you have calm abiding, you have this humongous opportunity now. You have this incredibly powerful tool. How do you use that tool to achieve something of value? So he says, should someone who has thus achieved calm abiding, the non-conceptual meditative stabilization explained above, sustain just that non-conceptuality characterized by clarity and non-conceptuality and so forth, right? So he's saying, so should you just rest in that calm state? And what his answer is going to be, no, don't just, and you can see how it would be very tempting, right? Because it's much more pleasurable than anything else, and much more peaceful, and much more refined than anything the person has ever achieved previously. But Lama Tsongkhapa is saying, but don't just rest there, because that's just like, that'd be sort of like the person who it's just like you're on vacation or something. You're not actually liberated. You're getting a vacation from the intense suffering of your normal life, but it'd be like using up all your savings and then you're going to have to go back. He's saying, use what you've achieved to do something meaningful and permanent now. So he's saying such a meditative stabilization has been generated in the continuum is for the sake of now he's getting it. So now we're going into the transition to special insight. So he's saying such a meditative stabilization has been generated in the mental continuum for the sake of generating special insight that destroys the mental afflictions. Therefore, if special insight does not arise in dependence upon it, however much you familiarize yourself with meditative stabilization, you will not even be able to abandon the mental afflictions of the desire realm, not to mention the mental afflictions as a whole. For that reason, it is necessary to cultivate special insight. Right, so he's saying if you achieve calm abiding, you must use it to generate special insight. Right? And it's only special insight that actually overcomes the mental afflictions and liberates us. That's clear, right? He's being extremely clear. And it's quite important because, again, you could think, oh, my mind's so clear, I must have special insight. He's saying, no, special insight is a separate realization. And now, and this is, I'll just say, now he's getting into a section where he says how there are two special insights, or types of special insight, that can be cultivated. And personally, I found this useful, because actually, I'll say this, for years when I was first involved with Buddhism, I thought special insight only meant understanding emptiness. But that's not the case, and he explains that here. So he says, basically he says there are two types of special insight. By the way, special insight is a English, right, translation. Tibetan is Loktong, sometimes you'll hear that. And Vipassana is actually the, when you hear the word Vipassana, that word means special insight, right? That's the original term. So here, Lama Tsongkhapa points out that there are two types of special insight. And he said, one he calls mundane special insight, and the other super mundane special insight. And so what he's saying is this, is that mundane special insight is, I'll describe what that is first. Mundane special insight, and he goes into a little more detail later, is where a person, using calm abiding, and actually it's a whole process, so maybe I'll describe it, right? The person who has calm abiding, right, can absorb their mind, as we just described, in, say, in the nature of mind itself, the conventional nature of mind, right? So being clarity and knowing and bliss, pleasure. But then if you want to gain special insight, you have to do contemplation, a contemplative meditation. You have to reason, think, right, in order to gain some kind of new insight. And so he doesn't go into this much detail here, but I just want to describe it briefly, so I think it'll help you understand what he's getting at. So what he's saying is what he's getting into now is this. So the person who has calm abiding can absorb their mind and have this incredible clarity, and you can see how it's very tempting to just stay in that. Right? What Lama Tsongkhapa starts to get into now, though, is now that person needs to cultivate special insight. Special insight requires that they go back to using some kind of analysis. And when they use analysis, it will disturb their mental calm abiding at first. Right? They won't be able to stay as absorbed, because they're starting to think discursively on purpose now. So it will slightly disturb their calm abiding. And then the person has to go back and forth. So the mind of calm abiding is incredibly powerful, right, and focused. So they have to practice this thing of using analysis and reasoning and then going back into calm abiding. Using analysis and reasoning, going back to calm abiding. And in order to gain a new insight. Does that make sense? Or a kind of an insight using that powerful mind. And eventually, if they keep doing that, the going back and forth between calm abiding on say, some aspect of what they're starting to realize, and then using reason to realize something, and then eventually they reach a point where their mind has a realization with that incredible power of the focus of calm abiding, which is incredibly transformative compared to our insights, which don't have the power of a concentrated mind like that. Okay, so now he's saying there are two types. One is mundane. So a mundane special insight is, in this context, what he's talking about is the person looks at the realm, like they're at a point where they're, because of their concentration, where they look at whatever realm they were just in, say the desire realm, and they look at the faults of the desire realm, its grossness, its suffering nature. Then they look at the pleasure of the form realm, of the first concentration, and they see that, wow, that's a lot better than the desire realm. It doesn't have, people there there's no arguments, there's no craving, there's no agitation. There's incredible peace and bliss, and the level of pleasure in that realm is much greater than the highest pleasure of the desire realm. One Lama who was commenting on the thing in one of these books said, from the point of view of the person in the form realm, when they look at somebody, like the most wealthy person, and sort of the person who's experiencing the most pleasure in the desire realm, it looks like they look like a monkey by comparison. He's saying, if you look at a monkey that's sort of eating some fruit or something, you're like, oh, I'm glad that's happy, but it's a monkey. You feel like, well, you're a human being who has more ability. But it's kind of like that. If they look at the greatest pleasure we've ever experienced, they would go, oh, it's like a monkey eating a banana. The way we would feel at that. It was just like a metaphor for trying to get it. How does it feel? that it's this more refined, more pleasurable, more exalted sort of state, a higher state of being. Anyway, so the person who's at this point where they're doing this contemplation, they start looking at their own experience of the desire realm and the others' experience. They see like, oh, there's all kinds of arguments, it's rough. You know, whenever you finally get something, you lose it. Nothing's reliable. Everything can sort of fall apart at any moment. You know, people, you know, you finally find somebody you really like and they die and all that, all kinds of horrible things can happen. Whereas in the form realm, there's this incredible stability, an incredible pleasure that's not as, what's the word, evanescent or something like that, and so on. And so by contemplating that, they start to develop a kind of experiential transition towards the form realm, or towards the first concentration. And we'll get into their steps to that. But, so that's a mundane special insight, is the person gains an insight into how much better the higher realm is than the lower realm, and therefore they transition into that higher realm. And the person goes through that process if they want to, the mundane one, where they can go to the first concentration, the second concentration, the third concentration, the fourth concentration. If they want to keep doing that process of comparison, they can then go to the first level of the formless realm, second, and so on, all the way up to the peak of samsara. And so those are mundane insights. Why are they mundane? Because they don't lead to liberation. Right? They just lead to a more pleasant meditative experience. But those do have the ability to temporarily abandon the mental afflictions associated with the lower of those realms. Does that make sense? Like, so if you achieve the first concentration, you do succeed for a period of time in abandoning all the mental afflictions associated with the desire realm. So you don't experience those when you're in the form. You know, if your meditation goes into the form realm, into the first concentration, you don't experience all the mental afflictions that we have in the desire realm. So that is a kind of temporary abandonment of certain kinds of mental afflictions. And they describe it, there are 9 levels of subtlety of mental afflictions associated with the desire realm. And the person goes through a process of abandoning the gross of the gross, and the middle of the gross, and the subtle gross ones, and there are middling ones, and then finally they get rid of the subtle ones, and they achieve the first level of concentration, and so on, of the form realm. And so that's a genuine special insight, but it's mundane because it doesn't lead to enlightenment. Then he says, and that's where he says here, he says, the former is a meditation on the coarse and peaceful aspects. So coarse means that the lower realm is coarse and the higher realm is more peaceful. Viewing the lower level is coarser and the higher one is more peaceful. Yeah. And then he says the latter. So now he's saying what's super mundane? Special insight. He says the latter is a meditation on the view with the 16 aspects of the Four Noble Truths, impermanence and so forth. Both are set forth in the Shravak levels, the principal one being the view that realizes the selflessness of persons. So what he's saying here is that what's super mundane or sort of transcendent special insight. And he says, one could say it's realizing the various aspects of the Four Noble Truths. Ultimately, it's realizing selflessness. And according to the Prasangika view, it's realizing emptiness. Prasangika school would say it's realizing the emptiness of intrinsic existence or inherent existence. The Shravaka levels text is not presented from a Prasangika perspective, so they say selflessness of persons. Right? Chandrakirti, who's a Prasangika Madhyamaka philosopher, would say they have to realize emptiness itself. But in the Shravaka levels, it would say selfless of persons because it's not, that's not presented from the Prasangika philosophical perspective. But it's making the same point, right? That one has to realize the ultimate nature of reality. And that's the super mundane special insight. Then he says, that being so, anyone, non-Buddhists who abandon manifest afflictions by cultivating the paths of the coarse and peaceful, Buddhists who abandon the afflictions by meditating on the meaning of selflessness. So here he's making a point. He goes into detail about something. He's saying, any sort of exalted spiritual goal you want to achieve, and he gives examples here. He says, if you're a non-Buddhist and your goal is just to achieve, say, the form realm concentrations, formless realm concentrations, if you want to do that, you need calm body. Right? Then he's saying, if you're a Buddhist, then you want to achieve your own liberation. You have to realize selflessness. You have to have special insight into selflessness or emptiness. Right? And to do that, you need calm body. Then he's saying, if you're a Mahayana practitioner and you want to achieve Buddhahood, you have to have a direct realization of emptiness. And for that, you need calm body. Then he says, even if you're a Vajrayana practitioner, to progress to the to complete even the generation stage, much less the completion stage of Hayashyoga Tantra, you must achieve calm abiding. And so he's saying, therefore, calm abiding is crucial as the basis of progress of the paths of all yogis. So he's saying, if you really want to progress, if you're going to be a yogi, whatever your goal is as a yogi, whether it's a non-Buddhist goal, one way to say it is all the different paths, right? Or vehicles. We say there's like the lesser vehicle, the great vehicle, the Vajra vehicle, all these different vehicles. He's saying, if you're going to be a yogi of any of those vehicles, you need calm abiding to make progress to the higher levels of any of those yogic vehicles. Is what I'm saying. Even if your goal were just a good rebirth in the form and formless realms, but for sure, if you want to achieve liberation from samsara, Buddhahood, or the kind of Buddhahood through the Sutrayana, Paramitayana, he says, version of the path, or through the Mantrayana, so the Vajrayana version, all those you still need to achieve calm abiding to achieve these higher levels.
So I get confused. Like some sutras, you read them, then it'd be like, if you read this sutra, you're gonna be reborn as a god. I mean, but if they say you're gonna be reborn as a god, that means you don't need to practice calm abiding. If you read the sutra a certain period of time, then if you die, you're gonna be reborn as a god. So how do you become a god when you didn't practice meditation? You didn't practice calm abiding?
A couple points. One is, like, there are two different types of gods. From the Buddhist cosmology, there are beings in the God realm where it's part of the desire realm.
Yeah.
And there are descriptions of those gods where they even have problems with the jealous gods. The jealous gods are making fights with them and so on. There are descriptions like that. So one is, it could be that kind of God realm.
So that one you don't need calm abiding.
You don't need calm abiding to achieve that.
Okay.
So that's maybe that.
Yeah.
Then he makes another point. He says, for Buddhist practitioners, he does a double negative here. He says, it is not unacceptable. So it means it's okay. If you lack the former of those two special insights. So he's saying, if you're a Buddhist practitioner, achieving the form and formless realm absorptions, you can do those or you cannot do them. They're not essential. But achieving in order to realize special insight into selflessness, but you must have at least calm abiding. Right? So he's saying Buddhist yogis can go through the form and formless realm absorptions, and some do, or they could not do that. But if you want to gain special insight into emptiness, you must at least have calm abiding, which is considered. And then he says here, calm abiding, which is included in the preparatory stage of the first concentration. Right. So in other words, calm abiding is at that preparatory stage of the first concentration. You must at least achieve that in order to gain special insight into emptiness. Whether you go beyond that into the various different form realm absorptions and so on is kind of up to you, but you must at least achieve that. Then he says, again, he says this various ways. The only way to achieve liberation from samsara is a dependence upon special insight. And special insight depends upon, first of all, understanding emptiness, but also on having achieved calm abiding. So that you have to achieve calm abiding in order to become liberated. And then you must use that, though, to realize selflessness.
So wait, sorry. When you were talking about the not essential, the thing that's not essential, is that the mundane
Yes.
special insight? Yeah.
Exactly.
So you can skip over that.
Yeah, you don't have to go through all that.
It's not like a stepwise thing.
No.
Right.
Yeah, once you get to, you can't skip over calm abiding itself,
Yeah.
but if you don't want to do those other
Yeah.
levels, they're not essential, he's saying here. Yeah, exactly. Yeah, the mundane. Whereas the super mundane is absolutely essential and can never be skipped over if you want to achieve liberation. And then he says here, he's saying the same thing, but just to be he's repeating it in various ways. He says, if you do not realize the nature of selflessness and fail to meditate on it, you will not free yourself from cyclic existence, from samsara. Right? Even if you abandon the manifest mental afflictions up to the level of complete nothingness and attain the peak of existence, the peak of samsara, by means of calm abiding explained above, through mundane special insight, right? So he's saying, if you just do the mundane, you get it. If you just do the mundane version, even if you go through all those different levels back and forth, and you keep achieving different, all the way up to the peak of samsara, the peak of existence, that's not going to get you to liberation. You absolutely, positively must have special insight into the nature of selflessness. He's saying it over and over in various ways, just so that nobody gets confused. And then he quotes these verses. He says, "Beings who fail to turn to your teachings, who are blinded by delusion, having gone to the peak of existence, attain an existence and suffer again." Right. So he's saying, if you don't turn to when he says, "who fail to turn to your teachings," he's referring to the Buddha. He's saying, if they don't follow your teachings on emptiness, is the implication here, then even if the being goes all the way to the peak of psychic existence through their meditative concentration, they will fall down and suffer again in ordinary samsaric suffering. Then he says, those who do follow your teachings, without attaining the basis of concentration, still avert existences. So he's saying, you don't have to go into all, what he's saying there is you don't have to go through all, same thing, you don't have to go through all those different levels of concentration. You just need calm abiding and to realize the nature of selflessness, and then you overcome the four maras, right? And remember, the four maras are the mara of death, the mara of the contaminated aggregates, 5 aggregates of samsaric existence, the mara of the mental afflictions, and then there's they call it the mara devaputra, like an actual being who interferes with others' spiritual practice. He's saying as long as you achieve the realization of emptiness combined with combining, you can overcome all those four maras and achieve liberation. That's the point. The four maras are the obstacles to liberation.
So when you achieve selflessness, you don't overcome any maras, right?
What's that?
So when you achieve selflessness, you don't overcome any maras.
When you achieve the realization of selflessness conjoined with calm abiding.
No, without calm abiding, just selflessness.
Oh, without calm abiding.
Yeah.
I guess it's what's there to say right? Remember Kensei Rinpoche quotes, what's his name? Arya Deva. It says, even just a doubt about selflessness tears samsara to shreds, right? That's a famous quote. So I guess the point here would be, even without calm abiding, if you realize emptiness, you're undermining samsara, but you're not yet free from it. Yeah, you haven't yet actually liberated yourself. You have to conjoin it with calm abiding eventually, or you won't achieve liberation. That's true.
Yeah, because when you're aware, like what's going on, when you're aware but you don't overcome, you're aware but you didn't overcome them.
Yeah, and part of that I think is like if the person realizes, part of the idea I think is this, is if the person realizes emptiness before calm abiding, Lama Tsongkhapa described that earlier, for that person of course, once they realize emptiness, that will enhance their renunciation of some sort, right? If they realize emptiness, they'll realize, wow, I and all beings are caught up in an illusory belief system that causes suffering. So then it'll help the person generate renunciation, and then that person will want to go off and practice calm abiding in order to actually achieve liberation. And that person could be the person then who meditates on their previously realized understanding of emptiness as the basis for calm abiding. That would be that kind of person, actually. So they could do that. Whereas ordinary, somebody who hasn't realized emptiness can't do that.
So is this super mundane special insight the same thing as realizing emptiness, or is there a subtle difference between those two things?
Yeah, no, this super mundane special insight would be a realization of emptiness. Okay. And I guess the reason why I paused is that, the word, sometimes I had this conversation with Kensei, I was confused about it. The word, when we say realizing emptiness, I was saying well, what does that really mean? And one thing Kensei Rinpoche was saying is that, a realization can have different, the word realization, in a sense, can have different meanings. Yeah. There are different levels of realization. And so, but special insight into the emptiness would be one of the types of realization, a very important type of realization of emptiness. So it's definitely included as it is a realization of emptiness. So yes.
But not is it not the same as wisdom, where you understand it directly or something, that you perceive it directly?
Yeah, well, actually I'll say it this way, there are more, but I'll give 3 different examples of a realization of emptiness, one of which will be this. The Fridel's question was one example. So there could be a person, there are many examples of this actually, people who study emptiness and contemplate it, who don't yet have calm abiding, right? but they study emptiness and they spend a long time contemplating emptiness and, creating merit and purifying their negativities and thinking deeply about emptiness, but they've not yet achieved calm abiding. And eventually they have the experience of a kind of very profound insight into emptiness. It's not special insight, but a genuine realization where through reasoning they have a correct conceptual realization of emptiness that's very profound. That's an insight into emptiness that is a realization, but it's not a special insight.
Yeah.
Then there's the person who has achieved calm abiding, does that same process of contemplating emptiness, and with a powerful mind that's already achieved calm abiding, has a kind of correct, still conceptual, it's still actually conceptual at this point, realization of emptiness. That's the one that we're talking about here, where they achieve a kind of correct, but still subtly conceptual, I would call it, realization of emptiness. That's a special insight. It's a very powerful experience because of the power of their mind. And then on the basis of that special insight, when that person who continues to then meditate on emptiness, on the basis of their mind of calm abiding, they continue to practice meditation on that special insight, they eventually achieve a direct realization that's non-conceptual. But this special insight at this level always comes, you first gain a kind of special insight that still has a subtle conceptual element, and then by continuing to meditate on it, you achieve a non-conceptual realization. So all three of those we could correctly call it, if you said this person realized emptiness, it wouldn't be incorrect in any of those three cases, but they're very profoundly different experiences. And then Lama Tsongkhapa makes one last point, which I'll read out loud just because, again, it's an important one. He says, for that reason, yogis of highest yoga tantra also need to develop one kind of calm abiding, even though they do not generate the special insight that observes the varieties of peaceful and coarse aspects of calm abiding accomplished by means of it. In fact, the point where it first arises is during the generation stage. So here what he's saying is, for people who are practicing Vajrayana, or tantric path, they don't have, he's saying they're an example of somebody who doesn't need to do all those different mundane types of special insight. They don't worry about going through those different levels of the form and formless realm. But for the yogi of highest yoga tantra, they still have to achieve calm abiding, and in fact they achieve it near the very end of the generation stage of highest yoga tantra. There are two stages in highest yoga tantra: generation stage and completion stage, which come in order. Generation comes before completion. And he's saying, that the yogi of highest yoga tantra achieves calm abiding while they're still on the generation stage, and then they go into the completion stage on the basis of that, and they can achieve enlightenment in one lifetime. But they don't need to do. He's saying they're an example of somebody who doesn't need to do all the mundane special insights, but they do need to achieve calm abiding, and they do need special insight into the nature of emptiness, or it's not liberate. Even with highest yoga tantra, if the person doesn't understand emptiness correctly, they're not going to even achieve liberation, much less enlightenment of Buddhahood. So they still need special calm abiding, and they still need special insight into emptiness. And by conjoining that with the methods of tantra, they progress more quickly to Buddhahood. That's the main difference. Okay, I know. So anyway, does that make sense about highest yoga tantra? And then Lama Tsongkhapa this will be the last section actually so we'll finish this bit about the calm abiding, this transitional period, because the next page starts special insight. So now he makes another point. He says here, again he's going back to the Shravaka levels, the Sanghas text. He says, here Shravaka levels explains that from the ninth mind you are a beginner in the attention as long as you have not achieved attention. Whereas one who has achieved attention out of desire to purify all afflictions cultivates attention, individually knows the characteristics. So here what he's getting at is this, for the person, when he says ninth mind, he's describing how, we said, calm abiding arises in dependence upon the 9 preceding levels of meditative concentration, right? So the person, meditates and they achieve the first of those 9, and the second, third, fourth, fifth, sixth, seventh, eighth, ninth. And on the basis of that 9th mind, they continue meditating and they achieve calm abiding. So now, he's talking about the mundane special insight here, because this is the last bit about that, and then he's going to get into special insight into emptiness in great detail. And so I'll just present this briefly because he presents it. so what he's saying is, it's interesting, right? The person who's achieved calm abiding at that point, which from our point of view, if you've not achieved calm abiding, seems quite exalted, right, and quite remarkable. What he's saying is, first of all, that person is a beginner at from the point of view of all the other levels of concentration. That person is now a beginner. They've just entered into the experience of these higher levels of concentration, right? So from our point of view, actually, it's kind of funny. If you said, if you say, oh, this monk or nun achieved calm abiding, it would seem like, wow, that's quite a remarkable achievement, which it is, But then he's saying, from the point of view of the higher levels of concentration, they're a beginner at that. Now he's going into detail about something, and he's saying, remember earlier I said, so the person who's achieved calm abiding is no longer categorized as being in the desire realm, they're categorized as being in the preparatory stage of the first level of concentration. And so now he's describing, well, what does that mean, preparatory stage? And he's saying, actually, and it's interesting, he lists 6, whereas a lot of these texts list 7, which I actually think, for me, it's easier to conceptualize it as 7 levels. So what he's saying here is, I'm going to think of it spatially. I'm just going to use a metaphor for a second, right? If this is the desire realm, right, and then you get to the preparatory stage of the first level of concentration, which is included in the first, in terms of categories, it's not part of the desire realm, so you can say it's included as in terms of categories as within the category of the first level of concentration, but it's not fully qualified yet, first level of concentration. And what he's saying is, between that, where you first achieve calm abiding, and you're in this beginning, there are actually 6, or I think 7 is a better way to talk about it, 7 sort of steps one goes through in order to achieve the fully qualified level of the first concentration. And this process of going through these 6 or 7 steps is the process of developing mundane special insight. Does that make sense? And when you have achieved that mundane special insight, you've achieved the first level of concentration. And actually, these, in the way they describe it, then these 6 or 7 steps, actually it's funny, in this text he goes through it, he says, like, this is typical, I always think I like this actually, but it's a typical thing in Buddhist texts where they say, you can categorize them as 6 or 7 or 4 or 3, and it's the same process, it's just different ways of looking at that process or something, it'd be like saying how many years of college do you have to go through versus how many semesters, or something like that, versus how many credits. If you were going to try to graduate, and you could say, well, you need, a very large number of credits, but you need this many years, and you need this many semesters, but it's all the same meaning. It's just like you categorize different ways, so that's what they're getting at there. But so what he's saying is, when you achieve calm abiding, right, you're at the very beginning of the process of entering the fully qualified first concentration. And then I'll list, so then he said, after that, so that, or the reason why I'm saying maybe you could say 7, is that calm abiding would be the first. Right? And then there are 6 more. And those 6, I'll just say their names. They're individual knowledge of the character, belief, isolation, joy withdrawal, analysis, and final training. And so Lama Tsongkhapa is saying, that you go through those 6 in order to achieve the fully qualified first level of concentration, if that's your goal, right? If your goal is, we don't have to do that, as we were pointing out, but for the person who's on the mundane path and wants to do that, they would have to go through this process. And I'll just say at the very end of this whole section, Lama Tsongkhapa says, for fear of wordiness, I have not written here about how to free oneself from attachment to the desire realm by means of the 6 attentions. So what he's saying is he doesn't go into huge detail about this. And so I'm not going to either, Lama Tsongkhapa doesn't, but I will make a general comment about it. Part of the process, and it's described in these books in much more detail, is so you can imagine, just to imagine this for a second, right? So the person has achieved calm abiding, right? And they have this remarkable ability to sort of stay absorbed in the clarity and knowing, with a very, a kind of blissful experience of this clear and knowing nature of mind. And they're in this first beginner's level of the preparatory stage of the first concentration. So now, if the person wants to cultivate special insight in order to progress to the first level of the form realm, the first concentration, what they have to do, again, as I was starting to describe, right, is they start to then analyze a bit with this powerful mind they have, right? So they think about the faults of the desire realm, the advantages of the form realm, the first concentration. And they think about how the desire realm is gross and has all kinds of suffering and all kinds of, even its pleasures are kind of not that pleasurable and are not stable, and the first concentration is much more pleasurable, much more refined, and much more beautiful, much more wonderful, and so on. And as they do that, of course, as we were describing earlier, their concentration becomes, isn't as absorbed because they're conceptualizing on purpose, right? And then they have to kind of both, so they have to do a number of things. They have to kind of gain an insight into, like an actual, through their contemplation, a kind of insight of the truth of that this other realm is better. But they also have to kind of learn to, what's the word? You know, they have to be able to kind of conjoin that insight with their calm abiding, right? And not have their mind be disturbed by the contemplative process. So that's why there are steps involved. You see what I mean? Like they have to kind of contemplate that, and then go back into calm abiding. Then they have to kind of develop a belief, right? A kind of belief that that's true, for example. And then they have to focus their mind on that, and so on. And through this process of doing that, one other point is, remember earlier I said there are like different levels of what's happening as they're doing that process also is that, as I mentioned earlier, they categorize the afflictive emotions of the desire realm into 9 levels of subtlety. Like from the grossest gross afflictions to the subtlest subtle afflictions. So you can see so they have gross, middling, and subtle, and then each of those 3 has gross, middling, and subtle. You get that, so that makes 9. So the person, as they're progressing through these 6 or 7 levels, has this experience where, as they sort of do that, they eventually, first, like they have this experience where the gross mental afflictions of the desire realm sort of fall away, and they experience some kind of relief. And you can see how that would also give them even more encouragement. Like, wow, like, that feels really wonderful. And if I keep getting rid of all the mental afflictions of desire realm, it'll be even more wonderful. And so then they get rid of the middling of the gross and so on. And that's part of this process also, of these contemplative meditations, where they have this experience of those mental afflictions kind of falling away. They're not permanent cessations. They can come back if they go back into the desire realm. But through the process of special insight meditation, they progress and get rid of, or temporarily abandon those different mental afflictions. And when in the final training, they abandon the subtle of the subtle. And actually, by the way, the analysis one I thought was interesting. The analysis one is where they've abandoned the gross and the middling ones, and it could feel to them, again, this is a possibility of misunderstanding. The person at that point could feel as if they've already achieved the first concentration, but then they have to analyze themselves. Does that make sense? And recognize, oh, I still have these really subtle mental afflictions associated with desire realm. And through their own self-analysis, they see that, and then they can start abandoning those. You can't see the subtle ones until you've gotten rid of the gross in the middle. Does that make sense? You can imagine that process, right? So that's why there are these different, that's part of why there are these different steps they have to go through, of sort of getting rid of different attachments in a way, or different graspings at the desire realm, and then noticing, wow, because you've been in the desire realm so long, there are very subtle levels of grasping at it. And finally, when the person gets rid of the subtlest of the subtle levels of attachment to the desire realm and other mental afflictions desire realm, they achieve the first concentration. And that same kind of process then is what a person goes through if they want to go from, say, the first to the second concentration. They start recognizing, well, the second concentration is even more refined than the first. And, they start comparing why one is more refined and the other is less refined and so on. And they go through, again, these kinds of stages, and eventually they achieve the second level, and so on. The person can do that all the way up to the...
So the mental affliction you talk about, they're the same like in Buddhist, and the mental affliction and they're the same, right?
Yeah, that's right.
Yeah, so what about suffering of change and pervasive compounding suffering? The mental affliction are different, right?
So the pervasive, the issue is the pervasive compounded suffering continues, even of being at the peak of samsaric existence, so this very refined level of the formless realm, has that kind of suffering. They're not free from that.
So they don't touch that.
Yeah, they don't even begin to get rid of that.
Yeah.
What they can get rid of, though, they don't have That person, though, at the peak of samsaric existence, doesn't have the suffering of suffering. They're not experiencing that at that time. And they're not experiencing the suffering of change, momentary change. What happens for them is that they have a period of time where they only are subject to the pervasive compounded suffering. And then there comes a point when their karma or the force that led them to that realm of experience runs out, and they see they're going to fall down. Then they experience intense suffering of suffering, because they see they're going to leave that realm and go back to being in the desire realm and probably in the lower realms or something. And at that point, that person experiences a kind of intense suffering. But for a period of time, that person gets like a vacation from the suffering of suffering and the suffering of change, but not from the pervasive compounded. So that the pervasive compounded suffering goes through all these different realms of experience. Yeah, and the pervasive compounded suffering is the only one, I mean, is one that can only be eliminated through the wisdom, understanding, selflessness, which is part of why we have to realize selflessness. So does that kind of make sense, though, in terms of the process of, again, and we're, Lama Tsongkhapa has said it. In other words, the main purpose in the Lamrim is, because the Lamrim is designed for people who are trying to achieve Buddhahood, actually, right? And so what he's saying here is, the main point for the person who's practicing the Lamrim is, once you achieve calm abiding, is to gain special insight into the nature of reality, into emptiness or selflessness. So he says here, he's describing what the mundane special insight is, so that people understand it, but he's not going to go into humongous detail here, because that's not the purpose of this text. He does that actually in other texts, where he's talking about, that topic more, but that's not the main topic here. So you would sort of say, if you want to know more about those, then you study those texts. If you want to know all the details of how to achieve those other states, which are useful, right? And many, bodhisattvas, in order to, there's a teaching actually in the Ornament for Clear Realization, the Abhisamaya Alamkara, where it says that, I'll just mention that, it's a beautiful teaching, where it says, like bodhisattva, like they say, like on the not Vajrayana, but the ordinary Sutrayana or Paramitayana path, that bodhisattvas take 3 countless great eons to achieve Buddhahood, right? They say Buddha himself, Shakyamuni Buddha, right, took 3 countless great eons. And they say that in there, Maitreya, in that Abhisamaya Alamkara, says, one of the qualities of a bodhisattva, because bodhisattvas want to be of benefit to others, right? So he says, actually, bodhisattvas traverse all these other paths out of their bodhicitta. There is not to achieve the result of them, but like, how do you, this is the kind of point, and the implication of that is, well, how can, the Buddha has to help, the Buddha teaches others how to become Buddhas, but the Buddha also teaches how do you become a solitary, here, how do you become a solitary realizer, right, like a Prajeka Buddha? How do you gain rebirth in the God realms or the formless realm? The Buddha teaches all those paths. And so in the Abhisamaya Alamkara, he says, so bodhisattvas, part of the reason they take a longer time, is that they traverse all those paths without achieving the results of them. Out of their bodhicitta, they say, well, let me go through the whole process that, let me go through the kinds of process that this person would go through, and then they come back. This person, the different categories. What are these different realms like? Because how can I, it's a good, valid point, right? How can you help somebody in the 3rd concentration of the form realm if you've never been there and don't know what that's like, right? You couldn't help that person. So the bodhisattvas do go through, eventually, at some various points along their bhumis and so on, they go through those different experiences, not out of some interest for themselves, but out of the wish to help others and to understand others' experience. So like, so there's a benefit also, there are general benefits to studying those things, but particularly for bodhisattvas, there comes a point, and like, for those who were there, like when Khenpo Rinpoche was teaching on the text by Chandrakirti, the Madhyamaka Avatar, there was a point where he describes how each of the each of the perfections corresponds to the different bhumis, right? And there's like the 5th bhumi corresponds to the perfection of concentration, right? And sometimes I used to think, well, if the person, I remember when I first say, I thought, well, the person already achieved calm abiding before the 1st bhumi. What do they still need about, like, why, what's the issue? Why do they need, what does it mean that on this, all the way later, so much later, on the 5th bhumi, they're achieving the perfection of concentration? And part of that is what we're talking about now a little bit, right? Whereas the person who's achieved calm abiding has achieved calm abiding and can realize emptiness, but they haven't necessarily gone through all those different levels of experience. And one thing that, one of the commentaries I was looking at before Kent Rinpoche came, I was like reading some of the commentaries, and it was describing how the person at that level, at the fifth bhumi, that they can, like, whereas the person with combining would take a humongous amount of, a humongous process to get to these different levels of concentration, right, going through these 7 levels and so on. That person has already done all those over and back and so on, and in an instant can enter. If they see somebody who needs help, who's in the, if they like recognize they will benefit others if they could enter the certain concentration, they can just go there in an instant and then come back to this realm in an instant and so on, and go back and forth because they have such facility with meditative concentration at that point. Whereas a person on the first bhumi doesn't have that facility. They have calm abiding, they've realized emptiness, but they don't have that facility of being able to traverse all these different form and formless realms however they want and whatever time they want. So that ability comes, on those bhumis and so on. And then and that's interesting because in the 6th bhumi, which is what Kent Rinpoche was teaching this year, which corresponds to the perfection of wisdom, right? Partly what the commentary was getting at is through the power of that incredible, the 5th bhumi bodhisattva's incredible ability to concentrate, then when they meditate on emptiness, they have an ability then to sort of realize emptiness with an even more powerful mind, right? The emptiness they're realizing is identical, but the mind that's realizing it becomes more and more powerful as the person becomes able to, they can meditate on emptiness from the perspective of the formless realm, for example, and so on. So that like their ability to sort of meditate on emptiness becomes incredibly refined because their mind is so refined. So you can see why there are differences then in terms of these different things. But anyway, that's the overview of the what's called developing calm abiding. Any questions about all of that? It's a huge topic, right? Like you can tell, like I'll make one more point in general, like like there are brief texts on these topics, but this middle length Lam Rim, I've just been finding it so beautiful, as we go over it, because it goes into humongous detail, doesn't it? And not so much detail. I mean, it gets a little far from maybe some of where we're at personally, maybe in meditation, but enough detail that you can really get a sense of what the process is, So I personally think it's incredible, even in comparison to some of the briefer Lam Rims that don't go into, they don't cover this Lam Rim text, that don't cover this level of detail. It's quite remarkable, I think.
So how it's kind of interesting. It's kind of cool to be a Buddha. It sounds like really cool. When you hear about this, it sounds cool to be a Buddha. So my question is, it sounds like very fun. So my question is higher beings, let's say higher beings who have achieved 10 bhumi, so how are they able to live in the world where they have different all those state of minds?
Actually, it's unimaginable, isn't it?
Yeah.
What they say actually is actually even after one is on the bhumis, the bodhisattva, it's different than a person there are bodhisattvas who are on the first two, remember the path of accumulation, we just said the 5 paths at the beginning today. So the path of accumulation and preparation are bodhisattvas, but if they're Mahayana, but they're not yet on the bhumi. The first bhumi corresponds to the path of seeing, and then the other bhumis are on the path of meditation. And if you read, it says it in Chandrakirti's Majjhima Avatara, and many other texts actually, many different texts, the text of Maitreya and things, that the experiences of those bodhisattvas on the bhumis are completely unlike us. And one way, I was talking one time to Kent Rinpoche, and he said, up to the 8th bhumi, so at the 8th bhumi, the person no longer has any mental afflictions. But before that, the person still has some mental afflictions, but that person still is not Kent Rinpoche said they're in samsara, but they're not a samsaric being, or they're in samsara, but they're not a samsaric being. And what he was saying is that person doesn't take rebirth through the power of mental afflictions and karma. They take rebirth through the power of compassion. And so that person, and actually those beings can manifest more bodies than one, for example, right? Like they say, beings on the bhumis can manifest different bodies and then absorb the bodies, but they're not like an ordinary person at all. So I think their experience is completely unlike our experience. And they say that even when they have when they're around others who are suffering, they don't experience suffering in this. They're engaging in the world out of compassion, and so, but they don't experience suffering in the same way we do. So their sense of being in the world is out of compassion and is completely different from our experience of being in the world.
So like His Holiness can be here teaching while he's manifesting other bodies somewhere, like other planets, right?
Yeah, that's what they
That's
would say,
beautiful.
for sure.
That's cool.
Yeah. Yeah, that's the description. They actually have lists, so you can see it if you read the commentaries to the Majjhima Avatar, where it lists the number of bodies that a Bodhisattva can manifest on different bhumis, and the number of, they're like, oh, there's a whole list. The number of Buddha realms they can visit in an instant, the number of bodies they can manifest, the number of, I mean, it's all just beautiful descriptions, but I don't remember the details of how many for each bhumi, but they get very large, like 10 to the something power, I don't know. Yeah, so I think the point, just to make it very simple, is that their experience of being in the world is not like an ordinary person. If you're on the bhumis, that's clear. And then we just have a couple minutes, so maybe I'll just say like an introductory comment then, which is that, so now, almost the rest, I mean, there's like almost the entire rest of the text, there's a tiny bit at the end that's like, an introduction to Vajrayana, mostly. At the very, very end, there's just a few pages. But the vast majority of the rest of the text is how to train, the new heading, right, that's on page 238, is how to train in special insight. An explanation of how to train in special insight, the entity of wisdom. Maybe I'll just say a couple comments in general, like as an introduction, and then we'll stop. Like, so Lama Tsongkhapa, obviously the author, I mean, is famous as like, now people often say, oh, he was the founder of the Gelugpa tradition, the teacher of the first Dalai Lama, or something like that, people say. But when you look at like what his contributions were to Buddhism in Tibet, and Buddhism in Asia, ordinarily, like any list of his top few, like he has a sort of few things he's most known for. Like one is, actually in Vajrayana, they say, in Vajrayana Buddhism, they say, in Highest Yoga Tantra, they say that his explanation of the illusory body is unique and is incredibly profound, and is more profound than, is more clear, let's say. That before he explained the details of the illusory body, it was very easy to misunderstand what it was. Once he explained it, if you study that, it's very clear what it is. So he says, in Highest Yoga Tantra, that's like a unique quality of Lama Tsongkhapa, is he explained that. He explained many other things, but they would say that that quality was so valuable and so unique that it's a unique contribution. And then they say his explanation of emptiness also is uniquely valuable. It's sort of really a remarkable sort of clarity. And that, not that others didn't explain emptiness, of course, but that he explained it in a way that clarifies doubts and makes it clearer than, and harder to misunderstand than others' explanation. That's what the Dalai Lama says, for example, about it. And then also, another unique feature of his is that, actually, sometimes they categorize that. If you think of Vajrayana, it's the illusory body. If you think of, Mahayana, one unique feature is this clarity regarding emptiness. And then another point is, this, in general, is the sort of how to integrate ethical behavior, with the path, and how you. So that was another unique feature. There's a huge emphasis on ethics, essentially, on being ethical while practicing on an inner level, the Mahayana and Vajrayana, but externally having one's behavior be always stay with sort of ethical norms, while internally, and that's not, none of these things are entirely unique. All the traditions have those, but they're just saying like he made those things very clear. But then in terms of emptiness, the point is that. And he's considered one of the three, like in the Tibetan tradition, they consider three great masters to be emanations of Manjushri. There are more, of course, but particularly the three who are famous are Sakya Pandita, right, in the Sakya tradition, Longchenpa in the Nyingma tradition, and Lama Tsongkhapa are the three who are considered to be kind of emanations of Manjushri, the Bodhisattva of wisdom. So again, there was this emphasis on wisdom. And so I guess my point is that, his teachings on emptiness are quite profound. Another point, the Dalai Lama, one time when I was in India, actually, the most recent, I've only been there a couple times, so the most recent time, the Dalai Lama was actually giving the transmission of this text, and I was there for the emptiness part. I missed the early part, but I got there in time for the emptiness transmission. And Dalai Lama was saying that from his personal perspective, he's always emphasizing like studying the great classics of the Indian masters like Nagarjuna and Chandrakirti and Asanga. He's always saying if you want to be a Buddhist and really understand Buddhism, you have to study. We have to study the works of the great masters of Buddhism. And then he was saying though that that one challenge is if you study those Indian texts, it's quite hard to understand them. Actually, if you just read them, they're quite ambiguous. And if you read Nagarjuna, actually that's why if you look at Western scholars' writings about Nagarjuna, especially up to now, but especially the early ones, they were like often just ridiculous misunderstandings because Nagarjuna's words are quite ambiguous, and so it's easy to misunderstand them if you don't have context. And many people did, where they kind of, if you read some of the early sort of Western scholars, what they say Nagarjuna meant is completely not what Indian or Tibetan masters would say he meant. They sort of read the words and sort of projected Western concepts onto that. But Tibetans did the same thing early on, actually. Sometimes if you read actually not just early, later, if you read some Tibetans, they also misunderstood what Nagarjuna meant. Well, many didn't, many understood it correctly. But anyway, my point, I guess, is this, is that Swami Lama said there are 5 main treatises on emptiness that Lama Tsongkhapa wrote. And actually, Swami said, it was sweet, he said if you read those 5 treatises and study them, then you can pick up any of the great masters' texts on emptiness and you'll understand what they mean. Because he clarifies the doubts and sort of raises all the misunderstandings so clearly that then when you read it, other texts, you'll be able to understand them. And so one of those 5 is this, is the emptiness section of the middle length Lama, is one of the 5 great treatises by Lama Tsongkhapa on emptiness. And actually, I think it's the second to last. So like he wrote them. He wrote them over the course of the latter part of his life, and as he was nearing the end of it, end of his life, I think this was the second to last major work on emptiness. So it's quite profound. It's a later work, so it kind of raises particularly profound, difficult points sometimes that he felt. I think sometimes he felt he hadn't addressed. Like I've said that throughout this book, right? Like Lama Tsongkhapa is always going like, what could people misunderstand? And let me raise the problem, and raise those doubts, and then clarify them. And so I think, like as he got later in his life, I think he was thinking, well, let me make sure I address for future generations like what they may misunderstand about emptiness, in order to sort of clarify those doubts or clarify those difficult points, so that future practitioners won't make mistakes. And so I think that's part of Lama Tsongkhapa's kindness, and getting to study this section of the book is like a gift from Lama Tsongkhapa to us, because we're part of, like, when you think, well, who is he trying to protect from misunderstanding and help? Well, we're included in that, right? Like it's us who was trying to help, among others. So I think to me it's a very profound text, and also a very precious opportunity to study something really remarkable. The last thing I'll say, so I think I still when I knew I was getting close to this part of the text, I said to Kitzer Rinpoche, should I just cover that one briefly, like that part briefly? He said, no, go into a lot of detail. Like he said, go through it very carefully and slowly. So I said, okay. I was thinking maybe it'd be easier to just do it briefly because it's difficult. Like people I wasn't sure if people would enjoy that. But.
So are we going to go through all the schools?
So we'll go through it. We're going to go through it as Lama Tsongkhapa presents it. So he raises some issues from other schools. So as he brings them up, we'll go into them. I mean, this text is not. There's another part of the FPMT basic program that's actually tenets, where you go through the actual tenet systems in detail and study each one in its own right. This text doesn't do that, but it does do some of that. Also, in Lama Tsongkhapa's text, if you look at, in all of his texts, he raises other Buddhist schools' views of emptiness in order to sort of say, to make distinctions. If you were here, you were here. When Ken Rinpoche was teaching on he was actually basing his commentary to Chandrakirti's text on Lama Tsongkhapa's Illumination of Thought, which is another of the 5 great texts by Lama Tsongkhapa on emptiness. And there, he does address some of those concerns. And another of the 5 is, which is I think the first or second that he wrote, was what's it called? Essence of Eloquence. Bob Thurman translated their translation of it. There he gets into a lot about other schools' views, other Buddhist schools' views and non-Buddhist schools' views, differentiating, because that text, the emphasis in that text is differentiating the definitive and the sort of provisional meanings of the Buddha's teachings. So that text goes into a lot of detail, especially about the mind-only school. It was longest detail, teaching the mind-only school's perspective about emptiness. Whereas this text mainly is focusing on the Majjhimaka, the Prasangika Majjhimaka view, but does raise different doubts and questions and then addresses them. Anyway, that was just like an introduction. But next time we'll start in on the special insight section. But let's do our dedication. The supreme jewel bodhicitta, where it has not arisen, may it arise and grow. Where it has arisen, may it not decrease, but increase more and more. In the snowy mountain paradise, you the source of good and happiness, all-powerful Chenrezig Tenzin Gyatso, please remain until samsara.